Pleased to be joined now by an NFL writer for The Athletic, who also happens to be a former NFL GM by the name of Randy Mueller. Is kind enough to join us here in the offseason. And Randy, hard to work on The Athletic. He's putting together a bunch of free agent lists at his top 150 up there recently. And that's kind of where I want to start, Randy, because we experienced something last offseason. Jordan Poyer was a free agent at the time, and people thought he was going to get gigantic money. And then the problem was there were 18 starting safeties in the free agent market last year, and nobody who wasn't named Jesse Bates got their money. Looking at the free agent safety list this year, it's every bit as long, if not longer. Are we in for another depressed safety market, and how might that help a team like the Bills, who could have two holes at safety before their cap compliance measures are done?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think safety really has kind of become an afterthought, to be honest with you, and supply and demand does dictate it. I think it's an area where a lot of teams just don't want to spend giant dollars. I think they're more anxious to put it on the perimeter, whether it's a receiver or a corner or some way to allocate their cap differently. And frankly, I think safeties have taken it in the shorts because of it. I'll say this, a safety for me is something that a veteran, a communicator, a guy that kind of is the glue back there is always valuable. How much value you can put on it, I don't know, but you mentioned Jordan Poyer, who is a really good player. I just don't know athletically he'll ever be anointed as being the guy like these young guys are that are probably going to get paid this year.
When free agency finally hits and the phones start ringing and you start talking to guys in earnest and trying to sign them and you're ready to sign deals you've discussed, that's all fun games, and we all love seeing what's been going on over the phone when out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. How does all of that change once June 1st hits and there's still some guys out there who can help teams? As a GM, how do those conversations go?
I think, Steve, the conversations are ongoing. I think they start, and maybe some have started already, but they may not culminate till after June 1. I couldn't agree more. I think there are a lot of teams who maybe are aggressive trying to win the press conferences early in the free agent period, but I think your depth can be determined later in the process, and that comes after the draft, after you have some boxes that weren't checked in the draft, that you can finally get a chance to really gain value and not have to break the bank on certain veteran players, especially come June, post June 1 per se. So I don't know that they wait and happen then. I think you've got to show love. You've got to be on the same page with agents, with players, I think, throughout the whole spring to make it happen and really fit it in that tight window of between, let's say, June 10th and August 1st when it counts.
Buffalo's defensive line is in for a lot of turnover. 8 of their 12 guys that were on the 53-man roster have contracts that are expiring. I know 3 of them made your top 150 list, namely Leonard Floyd, yeah, Daquan Jones, A.J. Epinesa. You mind giving us a quick thumbnail on what you think the market might bear for those 3 guys, Floyd, Jones, and A.J.?
Well, I think the market as we sit here today may change before the start of the league year, only because I think the edge rushers, let's just take them for example, and you mentioned Leonard Floyd, who I think really will be desired by a lot of teams. But there's some other guys whom I may have listed ahead of him. Other teams may have listed slightly ahead of him as being slightly more desirable, maybe because they're younger. But those guys are going to get tagged, I would assume. So that's going to probably make Leonard Floyd's value on the street even go up higher. I think anytime you can focus in free agency or have available to you a front 7 player, those guys are the price tag on them is going to be driven a lot higher just based on the nature of the position they play and how hard it is to get them. I think it is a good free agent pool for edge rushers. I think Floyd, maybe if guys don't get tagged, people will spend money elsewhere and the Bills will have a better chance to bring him on. I think a guy like Daquan Jones is going to be in high demand by a lot of people. And Steve will understand this. If you can find a player who can play 3 technique and maybe even some 5 technique and some nose, some versatility inside to kind of be like an innings eater, not necessarily productive on paper, but really productive for the people around him. I think people find that valuable in the NFL, and I know other GMs will. So I think he'll be a hot commodity.
I've spoken to other executives at different times, and they kind of think, when you talk about the league and the big picture of it, and there's 32 teams, and you have, like, say, if everybody ran a 4-3, you'd have like 140 some odd defensive linemen, just starters.
Yeah.
And then behind them, you got another 8. So it's like a couple of hundred guys playing that spot. What percentage of those spots are filled by there's not that many good players for the league. In fact, I had one executive said, we can't expand the NFL anymore because we don't have any big bodies that can really play. There's not enough good players that are genetically built to play defensive tackle. What are your thoughts on how big a percentage maybe the league is missing up at that spot?
Well, I think it's all supply and demand, and it's dictated by there are not a lot of guys with that size walking around the face of the earth. Trust me.
Right.
And it can be said for offensive linemen as well, especially tackles. Ask these people building these spring league teams that we see play in the XFL and find out from them that they have no tackles. They have no defensive linemen. It is hard to find guys at this nature, but I think that's been the success bar. Whether you're in high school, whether you're a college team, or whether you're an NFL team, it's about the big guys. And if you can find a way to acquire a few big guys and keep them, you stand a greater chance to win in this league, especially in the NFL. They're just hard to come by. And that's why if you find a guy like that can play multiple positions, they seldom ever get to the market. And you see these guys getting drafted in the top 10 every year. There's just maybe 1 or 2 a year that come out that are at the quality that we all want in the NFL.
All right, so let's take that and compare two different positions here. So you've got defensive tackle, defensive end. I think at least at the top, it's a pretty good year for edge rushers in the draft. It's also very deep at wide receiver. Now, there seems to be a bounty of wide receivers every year. They're easier to find maybe than premier edge rushers, but with two good classes at those two positions and knowing how high-priced those positions are in the free agent market, how does that impact a GM when trying to assess, fiscal responsibility with their cap when you have a deep class at that position as well?
Oh, it has a direct correlation to what you decide to do and how you decide to fill those needs if you have one. Without a doubt, every GM already knows where the depth of the NFL college draft is right now as we sit in, late February. I think they know that. They've met with their people. They have an idea. They have to forecast that to know where to pick their spots in free agency because, like you said, they may have to look for some value or overpay at a position in free agency that they know doesn't exist in any depth-wise come college drafts. So it's a juggling act for GMs. I've been there. You may have, and you guys might shake your head at this, you may have 50 deals, rolling around in your head at one time. It's crazy. And whether that's draft communication, whether that's free agent communication. And oh, by the way, like you said, we got about 15 of our own guys that we're dealing with too. So there is a lot of deals hanging around upstairs that I think the multitasking GMs have a better chance to fulfill and succeed at because of that. It's a lot. And I love that part of it. I always did. I always thought that was the thing that separated us is we could find a way to multitask and make deals with people on value per se. I think you have two things that enter in. You have your evaluations and then you have your valuations. And the good GMs can bring both of those into play, and they're totally different. They're different processes that you get to the end result in, but the good GMs find a way to balance those out.
How do you balance and we've got a GM here in Buffalo, and Brandon Bean, who rarely stays put in the first round. He always goes up a couple, down a couple. He moves around just a little bit for whatever reason. How cautious are you as a GM when a guy jumps on the table and says, if we go up a half a dozen spots, this guy's a generational talent or whatever, and you feel like maybe this guy may like the guy, but there's never a sure thing in these drafts. I mean, how do you balance a need and a want and an evaluation with making a pick and spending more than just that pick to get it?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And I think as the decision maker in these buildings like Brandon, you really have to know the people that you've surrounded yourself with. You have to know the evaluators as much as being able to evaluate on your own. I think it's a struggle sometimes in a room of people with opinions to not follow the loudest voice. And sometimes that's an art in listening as well. You have to find a way to temper passion and understand the agendas that are at stake and really evaluate the people on your own staff. So it is hard. I think there are deal makers that are really good at, like you said, Steve, moving around. I think they know the depth, they know the options. And really, when you make deals like the ones you've mentioned, you have to have a feel for options. You can't make deals when you don't have options. And so moving down 2 or 3 spots might give you still the same amount of options you had where if you'd have stuck where you were, or moving up might be an indicator of the supply just doesn't, relate to the demand. We've got to move up to get this guy because there's no fallback. So it's all strategic. It's all been planned and talked about early on. I love the process of doing that. In fact, it makes for draft days almost like studying for the law exam, right? You do all your studying, and then on test day, there's really no discussion because the best drafts I've ever been involved in, you've been through every scenario.
With the league having about half the teams still not in cap compliance, we got half the league that's going to have to be pretty disciplined in their spending on the free agent market. Now, of course, you can look at that the other way and say there's 16 teams that could spend, lavishly if they want to early on in the market. My question to you, Randy, is knowing you're going to have about half the league being a lot more discerning than maybe they have been in previous years because of those cap constraints, do you feel that gives a team that's a quote-unquote contender an advantage, knowing that if you're trying to appeal to a free agent you want and the money's all but dried up and they're getting already less than the market value they thought they would, could a team like Buffalo have an edge in light of their contending status over maybe some other team that's offering similar money?
Well, I think that's definitely possible. I think it's all about timing, right? And making these deals all comes down to the other options that a player might have as well. I think what fans and listeners sometimes misconstrued is that they think having cap space and spending equates to success. And that's not necessarily the case. I've seen a lot of teams win these offseason press conferences only to win 6 games the next year in the regular season. So I think just because a team has space, it doesn't mean they're on the right track. It means they have to make good decisions. And sometimes these teams with space, I have less faith that they'll make the right decisions going forward than a team like Buffalo, who I think is led by processes and by smart people and understanding of the system. I think they have a better chance. So you're right. I think being a GM and being a decision maker at team building level, and that's what we're talking about, it's about people and it's about relationships. And Brandon seems like the kind of guy to me that has a lot of relationships, that people respect him. And I think that helps you as much as anything in making deals. And maybe you make deals at the right time, but you have trust with the other side of the table. I don't think it can ever be one of those things where agents and the decision makers within a building don't trust each other, or you're going to make a bad deal at some point. So I think the Bills are in good hands. I wouldn't want to be $50 million over the cap, but they'll find ways to get under that.
And that's another question too. Why is it so difficult? Because we see every team, almost every team rides that roller coaster. There'll be a handful of years where they're over the cap every year. And then there'll be a time when, they have $50 million at this point of the season. They got $50 million under the cap. Why is it such a hard balance to strike to? And what would be the optimal place? Finish every season $5 or $10 million under the cap, and restructure a couple of guys to get you some room, and then just spend the money. I mean, what's the balance, and why is it so difficult for teams to strike where you get to that point where you're always cap compliant? You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to redo everybody's contract, push money down the road. I mean, why is that so difficult to do?
Because I think evaluating is hard, Steve, and I think bringing the right talent in is really what determines if you've made the right deals or not. I don't think you can ever get away from the fact that, hey, we can evaluate better than these other teams, and that's what teams do hang their hat on. I think the magic carpet that you're looking for is to have a really talented team, but have a sustainable cap structure and a sustainable cap allocation. That's the key. And that's why we talk about these positional priorities, where you have to spend money on the right positions, because you know these guys are going to be, one, hard to replace, and two, really hard to find anywhere. So you can't let those guys be a revolving door. You've got to identify core players. You've got to always be working with those core players to kind of free up enough money where you can build around it. And of course, it helps to have Josh Allen as your quarterback to make up for any gray area that we might have.
Yeah.
Taking that a step further, Randy, you already mentioned Jordan Poyer. He's got an $8 million cap figure. He's a 32-year-old safety, and I think we can all agree he's not the player he was in his prime and may have to take less of a role in this defense if he wants to stick around. That certainly isn't fitting of an $8 million cap figure. And you also have Tre'Davious White, another guy who for a while was a cornerstone player for this team, but now has had 2 major leg injuries, has missed 30 games over the last 3 seasons. His $16 million cap figure does not compute as good business. How, as a GM, do you handle those very delicate situations with players who have been cornerstone pieces for your franchise?
It's really hard because I've said this for years, the hardest job of a GM is knowing when to cut the cord with somebody that's given you their whole professional, really livelihood for the last 6 or 8 years, or even sometimes a decade. That is a really hard job. And it's something that since the invention of the cap, you really can't pay for prior really production. You have to look ahead. It's the unfair part of the business. Steve will appreciate this. You can't pay the Steve Largents of the world $1 million anymore because he was good 5 years ago. That just doesn't happen anymore under these cap, restrictions. So it makes it hard. But I'll say this, in the Bills case, when the Bills lost out this year, my first thought was, I'm not sure this team's good enough, and they're going to probably have to rework some stuff on defense. So I'm sure that's where the focus of Brandon Beane went. And he's got to rework some stuff, especially in the secondary. Now, I know they were devastated with injuries. You have to factor that in. But they're going to have to make some hard calls. They're going to have to find a way to upgrade from where they were a year ago. And that's never easy when you start the process of being as much over the cap as they are just to get compliant.
Yeah, it's one of those crazy situations as well. When you get a guy like Josh Allen as your quarterback, and he's been a wrecking ball at quarterback. His contemporaries, Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, have played well, but they've been unavailable at times because of injury.
Yep.
Not so with Josh Allen, but when you talk about a backup quarterback, what was your philosophy? Do you get a guy? And here's the thing: if you're going to get a guy that kind of mimics the starting quarterback, what happens when you've got a unicorn and there ain't nobody that does that? How do you get somebody that you still feel like gives you a chance to win with a good roster? If your top guy goes down, when you've got a top guy that's way ahead of everybody else.
Yeah, I think different philosophies for different teams for sure. I've been in the league 35 years. I would say Josh Allen is one of maybe a handful of guys that, one, can operate like he does, and two, that I can't wait for Sundays to watch. So I can really appreciate what he brings to the table. But having said that, I would have a backup quarterback in play somehow, some way. You'll never find a guy that has his skill set, but somebody that can process information enough to where our passing game doesn't take a step back. That, I think, should be the criteria. And maybe they've done that. I don't know. I think each year we see a different crop of backups kind of mix it up and move from team to team. Maybe that's the best way to accomplish it. But the criteria for me would start with, you have to have a functional guy. We said for years, and I think you guys will appreciate this, for years, that the Colts this is when Peyton Manning was the quarterback of the Colts. We said the Colts are an average team without Peyton Manning. And guess what? He finally got hurt, and we were wrong. They were way worse than average. They went way down and won 2 games the next year. So a backup quarterback is important, and some people value it more than others. I would surely find a way to set some money aside or set some type of value aside where if we lose Josh Allen for a couple weeks, our season's not completely derailed. Just my feelings.
Randy, thanks for all the insight. We appreciate it. Be happy to catch up with you later on down the line here in the offseason.
Thank you, Randy.
Thanks, guys. A lot of fun.